Hello, Leanne. Hi, how are you?
Hello. I'm well. Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Let's get straight into it. I'm so glad you wrote this book. I'm so glad you're doing this work. I'm a trauma therapist myself, and it's just, when you're working with adults who've been traumatized years ago by the educational system, they don't recognize that they've been traumatized, in my experience, until you point it out. They think they did the right thing. They went to school. Um, they were doing the thing they were supposed to do. I don't know. I might be way off base. Progressives have been fighting for better education policy for decades, but the one issue that American schooling doesn't get enough attention around is the psychological toll it takes on kids. Leanne Gray is here with us. Her book, Educational Trauma, is an urgent call to stop the harm we inflict on students every day in the classroom. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
First, can you talk about your work and why you started looking at ways that schools harm students?
I started to look at the way schools harm students in late 2005, 2008. I was in private practice, and many students were presenting to my practice with either a diagnosis of ADD and ADHD or they were requesting it. And I was just very perplexed at how that could be, because inattention and hyperactivity are symptomatic of about 70 other diagnoses, most of which were medical. And so there was this jump to a conclusion about these symptoms that was very troubling to me. I started to pay attention in my community as well when there was a lockdown of 9,000 schools, 9 schools and 9,000 people as a result of a school police officer accidentally shooting himself. He was reluctant to be honest and forthcoming about it. And as a result, he wound up lying about the fact that he had fired his own firearm, and he had indicated that there was an active shooter in the community, which resulted in the lockdown. This lockdown rippled out through the community in many ways and was a turning point for me to re-examine how the community, how North American students were learning, how teachers were being treated, how everything was being affected by this very antiquated educational system.
Unbelievable. What did you find? What how did you describe, or how would you um, define educational trauma?
Well, I found that educational trauma is the unintentional and inadvertent harm perpetrated and perpetuated every day in schools. I discovered that it's a poisonous pedagogy, which is a term from the early 80s, Alice Miller. Poisonous pedagogies are doing things to students that cause harm while thinking that these activities, practices, discipline programs are actually in their benefit. And so this is being perpetrated throughout our schools as a result of passing down maladaptive educational practices and paradigms through the generations and sanitizing them with euphemisms.
Oh, thank you. Let's discuss that. You talk about rigid standards, regular testing. Everyone thinks that's what you need to do to get an education. And you say that those are born of the same theories and practices as eugenics. Can you talk about that?
Yes, 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 yes. So the eugenics movement was actually originates here in America, even though it flourished in Nazi Germany in the 40s. And the eugenics movement evolved through Sir Francis Galton and his efforts to examine which of the qualities in people are most desirable and how do we parse out the less desirable or weaker qualities in humanity so as to produce racial purity. Sir Francis Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin, so we could see these evolutionary themes running through the family and the discourse at that time in history. Fast forward, and some of the earliest IQ tests were used to determine feeble-mindedness as well as capacity for and fitness for duty and service in the military. These tests were taken from the eugenics movement and some of the research that had been conducted at that time. And then later on, they were used with youth here in California. Youth that were involved in criminal justice, for example, became the subjects of studies that created the standards for these IQ tests. And essentially, they became utilized in the schools in a wide range of ways, such that they continue to this day to rank students, those that are at the tail end of of the bell curve, either on the weekend, tend to have low functioning, low academic ability, and on the higher end tend to be much higher functioning and have expectations of potential. As a result of this, we see that testing is a euphemized strategy, a paradigm that has been passed down over the generations and almost seems divorced from eugenics despite originating there.
That is fascinating. I haven't heard that discussed pretty much at all ever in educational policy or anything like that. That's really fascinating. So some of the examples of educational trauma that we see playing out every day come from testing. I would imagine that just from what you said, a person who tests lower on, particular tests or a group of tests could also have some form of genius that could be obviously useful to them, and they wind up leaving school feeling less than, marginalized, etc. Is that one of the ways? Because that's what I've seen in my practice, is like, if you didn't get good grades on tests, you have tossed aside, and then you internalize that tossing aside as you're not going to be useful to society in any way, or you're not going to be able to succeed in any way. Can you talk about that and talk about some of the other educational traumas we see playing out every day in our schools across America?
Okay, so when students receive grades that are not where they believe they should be or in line with their own experience of themselves and their potential, it's damaging to their self-esteem, their self-concept, their self-efficacy. It has a wide range of impacts. Unfortunately, the consequences of that experience is rather diverse depending on the skin color, the religion, the socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation. These are some of the things that will impact a student more so if they receive a negative grade. So let's say a student from the dominant culture who is wealthy receives a poor grade. It looks like school refusal. It looks like behavioral problems, and it can land them in some degree of treatment or protection. But on the other end of the spectrum, when we see students of color, LGBTQ students, students from poor communities, when they receive a bad grade, it's more like a stamp seal of approval that this at-risk child is now further down the trajectory of failure and moving their way inch by inch closer into the school to prison pipeline, with an ultimate destination of the prison industrial complex.
Is educational trauma occurring at every level in every kind of school, or does it differ between public schools and private schools, younger grades versus older grades? What are you finding?
So educational trauma is affecting everybody, all students to varying degrees, all teachers to varying degrees, parents, community, staff, administrators, anybody who interacts a school in any way ultimately feels the difficulties associated with these schools. We see mental health symptoms rising, and there seems to be a difficulty in making the connection between that rise of mental health symptoms and the fact that education is broken and we force kids to do that every day. But we have lots of documentation, increased depression, increased ADHD. The prevalence was at about 15% in 2015, 2 years before his death. Keith Connors showed us that that prevalence rate is unacceptable. Keith Connors is the one who created the gold standard test for diagnosing ADHD, and he felt that the way we are diagnosing is out of control. We see,
right, because you insist that children do things that are antithetical to a child, i.e. sit still and look at a teacher and listen and respond, when children are for jumping around, they're for playing, trying different things. They're basically tiny scientists that need to be encouraged in order to kind of uncover where their strengths might be. But our public schools certainly don't do that. We have certain kinds of private schools that are fighting against that pedagogy, but they're expensive and you can't afford to send them. Most people cannot afford to send their children to private school.
Right. The schools are practicing educational paradigms that are completely antithetical to students' needs for movement. And I'm going to take it one step forward, not only supporting what you stated, but then adding and elaborating that it actually disables a student's nervous system by not letting them move about and that stimulating the nervous system is a critical part of the learning process. It literally builds the hardware head to toe for a student to learn, memorize, regurgitate, calculate, apply, etc. So as a result of depriving students of these practices of play and movement, for example, we are further disabling them. We're contributing to reading problems, social emotional problems, conflict, and we certainly see the rise in school shootings as a function of this. And then to bring it to your last point about some families having the funds, the means to be able to provide this for the students, yes, there are some progressive schools that are addressing these issues. I find they're few and far between, even among the progressive, alternative, charter, and fully funded private institutions. There's a collective desire and commitment to doing it the way we've always done it. And it has
except for the Waldorf people. There's the Waldorf people and the Montessori people, and that's it, right? I mean, there are these two movements that try to do things differently, but they're pretty marginalized and fringy.
Yeah, Montessori and Waldorf are two examples of alternatives, and they are a bit fringy. And you can see that they're picked up in very small pockets of the world, not just the country, but all over the world. We have some others. I mean, I like the way design thinking has been implemented in at least one public middle school in San Diego. So that's a really big boom for education, to not only see something so innovative implemented so seamlessly and beautifully, but in a public school and not even a charter.
Talk about what that is for people who are unaware of that. The difference between that and, regular traditional American schooling. What's the difference?
So a school that is steeped in design thinking has taken a methodology from the design world, like architecture, and the way they look to serve their clients' needs has resulted in this process. And about a decade ago, the process was implemented in some K-12 organizations with the assistance of Stanford University's D School. This is a model of education that is based in a multidisciplinary approach to solving human-centered problems with empathy. And when we base a whole school around this one paradigm, what we see is that the power differential between teachers and students dissolves, because the teachers now embark on a journey of problem solving, something that's real, related to humans that are living right now, and they don't know the answer to this, quite like the students don't either. But rather, the teachers serve as guides, connecting students to other consultants and research and literature and information and history, so that in problem solving one humanitarian problem, students gain exposure to critical thinking, analysis, intervention, innovation, collaboration, communication, a wide range of skills all in once, and everybody is engaged. And we have seen this implemented successfully, again, in one public middle school in San Diego and several private schools across the United States. But it's just very new, and it doesn't get a lot of press. And even when it does, I see it very much overlooked. And that's essentially because we're looking to sustain the status quo, do it the way we always have.
Let's talk about the impact of these systems, systemic psychological problems. What kind of impacts happen with children? We talk individually, and then go on to talk about how this affects society generally. I know you spoke about people, the loss of self-esteem, self-worth. Can you talk more about this?
So the impact on the individual will start with the student, will range in age. So the younger students will show behavioral difficulties. They might show insomnia, school refusal, tantruming. It might look like the normal problems of childhood, just exacerbated somewhat. When we get into the early elementary years, we see failure to comply with rules, not turning in assignments, not completing assignments, avoidance, the things that look like distractibility. We will see more insomnia. We might see nightmares. When we get into middle school, that's when bullying starts to really take off, and that's a really impactful part of educational trauma or the traumas that are being perpetrated and perpetuated in schools. So, for example, I'm not sure there's anyone who has gone through middle school in the United States and not seen, experienced or perpetrated bullying. Like everybody has, including the teachers, the parents, and the administrators. So there's that bullying problem. And then we have the levels of bullying, which are even more deeply affecting the individual student, the teachers, the parents, the families, and the communities. We also see that that prevalence of ADHD diagnosis can be traced back to certain historical components in the educational system. And then ultimately, it culminates with the school to prison pipeline, which is a well documented process system in the United States. And it's actually unique only to the United States. So where educational trauma occurs worldwide, it is absolutely at its worst here in the United States, specifically because the school to prison pipeline leads students directly into the prison industrial complex. And those are well-known systems that have perpetrated the segregation and abuse of people that we thought we left behind in this slavery era.
We're talking to Dr. Leigh Ann Gray. Dr. Gray, the school to prison pipeline is very lucrative for the prison industrial complex, particularly the private prison sector, which is an abomination. But it seems like this issue of educational trauma is also very lucrative to another industry, which I'm surprised they haven't come to your house and try to gag you. The pharmaceutical industry, I would imagine, is benefits highly from children being traumatized and therefore given a diagnosis instead of trauma. And therefore, you treat a traumatized person with gentle care and humanity. And an anti-anxiety medication if need be, right? But treating them as having ADHD, treating them as having conduct disorder, treating them as having any other range of things that people get labeled as and then diagnosed around and then medicated around. This has got to be a moneymaker for big pharma. Your thoughts?
Yes and yes. I think indeed there is big business behind both of these. The prison, the corporations that manage the prison are indeed private. They're big business. They make more money when the prisons are filled. There's incentive all around for those prisons to be filled and all that. It's not just the corporations that are managing the prisons, but there is very, very reduced cost labor being provided to private industries. So we might be surprised.
Right. I forgot about that part. Yeah, you said it. I forgot. Oh, thank you for reminding us all of that horror.
But similarly, on the pharmaceutical side, there's of great benefit. I was alluding about the ADHD piece in the 80s. The pharmaceutical industry was providing professional development training to teachers in the schools around ADHD. And so the teachers were on the lookout for inattention and hyperactivity with the direction to send those kids to the pediatrician for a prescription. And this was literally enacted all throughout North America, not just in the United States. And that's what led to our overdiagnosis of ADHD. But this is also based in the larger culture, right? Our larger culture really does want a pill to fix everything. We don't want to sit down, take the time to be quiet, feel pain, experience what it's like to have our minds wander, to have our bodies agitated, and to work with the skills to manage that. Mm-hmm. And we certainly haven't taught that in schools. Therefore, a pill is really all that this culture offers for repairing human problems.
Unbelievable. How can we fix these deeply flawed educational issues that inflict educational trauma?
Well, I have written a few books prior to the one on educational trauma. So I have this one here on self-compassion for teens, over 125 activities on how to bring kindness and happiness and respect into the lives of youth, young adults. And so beyond that, I have about 200 more solutions published in a wide range of my books. And on the most mildest end, I encourage people to become a lot more empathic, to stop and listen to each other without having anything to say, simply with the goal of hearing one another. When schools can devote more empathy towards students and cultivate empathic listening and speaking skills amongst students, teachers, administrators, parents, and staff as well, then we'll see the emergence of what I call Empathic Education for a Compassionate Nation. And that title encompasses so many different ways of doing it. And it also includes the design thinking schools, the democratic schools, the Waldorf schools, the Montessori schools. So there's so many different ways that we can solve this problem And I have experimented with some of them. I have documented many of them, and I am here to serve.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the program. And I'm very happy that our activists are going to be watching and hopefully picking up and following you. Where can folks find you on the internets and your work in addition to the books?
I can be found at drleannegray.com, all one word. I can also be found on Twitter at Education Trauma. I have a few videos on TikTok. You can look around there. A few videos on YouTube, and more to come.
This is so great, and it's such an important area for really not only affecting individual students, but affecting the whole world. Imagine if we were taught empathy in our schools. How, and empathy is not political, right? Empathy is apolitical. Empathy is just a human value, and it's a skill that can be taught. Some people are more, prone to it naturally, and some are not, but it can be taught. Yes?
Well, the research shows that babies are born into the world with the capacity for empathy, except for a very small few. So that's very aberrant. And that when young ones, like 4 or 5 years old, come into school, they have the empathy, kindness, gifts and talents kind of schooled out of them. So it can be relearned, capitalizing on those innate abilities, but we're born in with that capacity.
Well, this show usually often just focuses on activism, progressive values, progressive activism. And, I think what you're doing kind of cuts it all off at the knees and basically says, gee, yeah, we have to deal with these problems up here that are happening. But if we can get at the base of it, which is, encouraging empathy from the breast to the grave or to the graduation or whatever, that would be a great, I could just see that being a wonderful thing for our society. So thank you for your work. I wish you all the best, and I'm happy to help promote your work as best as I can.
Oh, thank you, Juliana. Thank you very much for having me.
You're watching ACT.TV. I'm Juliana Forlano. If you are watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and spread this video around. Hit the thumbs up like button. Let me know in the chat or the what is it on YouTube? The comments. Every different outlet has a different name for everything. Let me know in the comments what guests you would like me to bring on the show. We're bringing on a lot more authors, experts, that kind of thing. I mean, we've always done that, but I would like to reach out to people that you would like to have on the show. So put them in the comments. I'm happy to read them. Also, I'd love to hear your feedback about your own educational trauma. If you feel like you were traumatized by the education system, did it even out? Did you get good grades even though you traded your soul for it and now you got a job that you can eat from? But, tell me. I want to hear your comments.